A Hollywood star was buried in his Dracula costume because he asked to be. Another invented Wi-Fi in her spare time, while the studio knew her only as a pretty face. A third rewrote the legal foundations of the entire American film industry by sitting across a desk and saying, "No, these are not legends. These are facts. And there are 15 more exactly like them." The trial that made him more famous. There is a particular kind of Hollywood star who seems to exist outside the rules that govern ordinary human beings, not because the rules do not apply, but because the public has quietly decided they should not. Errol Flynn was that star. He was the pirate king, the screen adventurer, the man whose name had already become a verb before the most famous trial of his career began. Us audiences adored him because he appeared to live exactly as his characters did, without consequence, without apology, and with a grin that suggested he found the entire spectacle of his own life enormously entertaining. He was, by any reasonable measure, exactly the kind of man that cautious people warned you about. And yet the public could not get enough of him. In 1942, Flynn was charged with the statutory assault of 2 teenage girls. The charges were serious. The studio braced for catastrophe. Jack Warner reportedly told associates that Flynn's career was finished and began quietly calculating what the loss would cost in contractual obligations. The trial transfixed the nation in the way that only a Hollywood scandal involving a genuine swashbuckler could. His attorney, Jerry Giesler, the most theatrical legal mind in a city that produced theatrical legal minds the way other cities produced accountants, mounted a defense that was equal parts courtroom strategy and public performance. Giesler understood something about the relationship between a celebrity and his public that most attorneys did not, that the audience watching a trial from the outside had already made up their minds before a single witness was sworn in. The press covered every session as though it were a premiere. Women lined up outside the courthouse each morning hoping for a glimpse of the defendant, some of them arriving before dawn to secure a position near the entrance. Fan mail arrived at Warner Brothers by the truckload, the overwhelming majority of it not condemnatory, but supportive. Several letters reportedly included offers of marriage. Flynn was acquitted. What followed was stranger than the trial itself, and there is a number that makes the strangeness concrete. His next picture, Gentleman Jim, released in the months following the verdict, outperformed his previous film at the box office by a margin that left the studio's accounting department temporarily speechless. His fan mail increased substantially. Audiences who had watched the trial with fascination emerged from it, not disillusioned, but somehow more devoted, as though the spectacle of Flynn facing genuine consequences and escaping them had simply confirmed what they already believed, which was that he was a man to whom the normal rules genuinely did not apply. He told reporters afterward that he had found the entire experience rather instructive. When the man who played Robin Hood had faced the full weight of public judgment and emerged with his legend not merely intact, but enlarged. The public had not come to the trial to see Flynn held accountable. They had come to watch him escape, and he had obliged them perfectly. The passing that stopped a city. If Flynn's story is about the public's refusal to condemn, then the next belongs to the public's refusal to let go. A grief so extreme, so prolonged, and so genuinely strange that it strains the boundary between devotion and something that has no clean name. Rudolph Valentino was a phenomenon so entirely new that no one had words for what he was. He had arrived in America from Italy with almost nothing and transformed himself through a combination of physical grace and an instinctive understanding of the camera's intimacy into something the film industry had never produced before. Women fainted at his personal appearances, not as a figure of speech, but literally requiring medical attention at venues across the country. His films generated a collective emotional intensity that studio executives found simultaneously profitable and faintly alarming. Fan letters arrived by the thousands each week, many written in languages his handlers could not read. Nobody had calibrated for this. Nobody had considered what would happen if one of these new creatures called a movie star were suddenly, at 31 years old, gone. In August of 1926, Valentino collapsed in New York from a perforated ulcer complicated by pleuritis. For 8 days, the country held its breath in a way it had never held its breath for a private citizen before. Bulletins were posted outside Polyclinic Hospital as they became available. Crowds gathered on the pavement below his window and did not leave through the night, standing in summer heat, waiting for news that most of them already feared. Newspapers ran updates in their earliest and latest editions, and readers bought both. When the announcement came that he was gone, the response was not the quiet grief of loss, but something rawer and more bewildered. The grief of people who had not genuinely believed it was possible, who had perhaps believed, without quite admitting it to themselves, that someone so beautiful could not simply stop. Outside the funeral home on Broadway, crowds estimated at 100,000 people lined the streets. Glass was broken. Police lines buckled. Several women were hospitalized on the scene. So 11 documented instances of profound grief-related self-harm in the days following were attributed by press accounts to the shock of his passing. A London woman reportedly sent her own surgically removed heart to the funeral home with a note explaining she had no further use for it, an account that period newspapers reported as verified fact, and which speaks to the particular intensity of the moment, whether or not every detail withstands modern scrutiny. A riot outside the funeral home required mounted police to restore order, a level of public disorder that New York City had not seen since the armistice celebrations at the end of the First World War. For decades following, a woman known only as the Lady in Black appeared at Valentino's grave on the anniversary of his passing each year, leaving red roses and departing without speaking to anyone. The tradition began spontaneously, continued for years, and eventually attracted those who claimed to be the original. Multiple women came forward, each insisting she was the one who had started it, each unable to prove her claim, each returning regardless. By credible accounts, the grave was visited on his anniversary for more than 40 years after his passing. Valentino had lived 31 years. His mythology lived considerably longer. The horror king who kept working after he was gone. Bela Lugosi defined Dracula for a civilization. His accent, his stillness, the particular quality of menace he brought to the role, these became the global template so completely that no subsequent actor has entirely escaped his shadow. He had arrived in America as a Hungarian stage actor with a limited command of English, learning his most famous role phonetically, speaking words whose meaning he only partially understood at first, in a cadence that turned out to be the definitive sound of cinematic evil. By the 1950s, however, Lugosi was broke, dependent on morphine, and appearing in pictures whose budgets would not have covered a single day of his Universal Pictures work. In 1956, he voluntarily checked himself into a California state hospital for rehabilitation, an act of courage that received almost no public acknowledgement at the time. He apparently recovered, spoke hopefully about future projects, and began work on a new picture for director Ed Wood, a filmmaker whose devotion to his subjects far exceeded his technical resources. 8 days into production, Lugosi was gone. He had not completed his scenes. The picture was unfinished. Wood hired a body double whose physical resemblance to Lugosi was approximate at best. A man who wore a cape and kept his back to the camera and hoped that audiences in the dark would not look too closely. He incorporated every frame of Lugosi he had and released the finished film to theaters. Audiences who purchased tickets had no way of knowing that the star listed above the title on the poster outside had been gone for months before the projector rolled. The picture was called Plan 9 from Outer Space. It has since become one of the most discussed low-budget productions in cinema history, not for its quality, but for the sheer audacity of releasing a film whose star had passed away before it was finished. Wood never publicly acknowledged the substitution. He took the secret with him. And there is the detail about that burial that has outlasted everything else. The detail that sounds most completely like something a screenwriter invented, and that is most completely true. Lugosi had left instructions that he was to be interred in his full Dracula costume, cape, collar, and all. His son confirmed the request was entirely sincere, made with the clarity of a man who had thought about it and decided. It was honored without argument. The man who had spent his career playing the undead asked to spend eternity dressed for the part, and Hollywood, for once, did precisely what it was told. He is there still. The contract that arranged a marriage. If you want to understand how completely the Golden Age studio system controlled the lives of its stars, Rock Hudson's story is the place to begin. Not because it is the most extreme example, though it is extreme, but because the mechanism of control in his case was so transparent and so institutional that it reads less like a human story and more like a case study in the industrialization of private life. The studio did not merely manage Rock Hudson's career, it managed his existence. Hudson was Universal's most valuable asset in the mid-1950s, tall, effortlessly handsome, and marketed with extraordinary success as Hollywood's ideal bachelor. His contract contained provisions extending well beyond his professional obligations. Among them was a clause requiring studio approval for any marriage. Studios had inserted such clauses since the silent era, the reasoning that an unmarried star generated more audience longing than a married one. This was not unusual. What the studio chose to do with that clause in Hudson's specific case was. By 1955, rumors about Hudson's private life had reached a fan magazine preparing to publish a story that would, if printed, end his career. Universal's publicity machinery determined that the most efficient response was preemption. Hudson's agent, Henry Wilson, arranged a marriage between Hudson and his own secretary, Phyllis Gates. The courtship was accelerated to a pace that left Gates herself uncertain of its sincerity. Hudson took her to dinner, was charming and attentive, and proposed with a speed that she later described as disorienting. The wedding took place in November of 1955. The fan magazine stopped its story, and the studio considered the matter resolved. The marriage lasted 3 years, ending in 1958, when Gates sought a separation. She later said she had not known with certainty what the arrangement had been designed to accomplish, and that the realization when it came had been its own particular kind of loss. Hudson maintained his public persona with discipline and dignity for another 27 years, until his diagnosis in 1985 made concealment impossible, and he chose, in the time that remained to him, to use his story rather than protect it. He became the first major celebrity to publicly acknowledge the illness. At a press conference in Paris, visibly frail and speaking with complete clarity, he looked directly at the cameras and told the truth that the studio had spent 3 decades helping him conceal. Research funding increased substantially. Charitable giving surged. Legislation that had stalled began to move. The clause that had been used to arrange his marriage had been designed to protect a studio's assets. Hudson, in the end, used his own story to protect something considerably more important, in a way that the studio, with all its machinery and all its contracts, had never imagined and could not have manufactured. The passing that should not have happened. Jean Harlow arrived on screen like an electrical current. Funny, fearless, and possessed of an energy that no amount of studio manufacturing could fully explain. She was the platinum blonde, the wisecracker, the woman who made audiences lean forward in their seats without entirely understanding why. Marlene GM had tried to make blonde bombshells before Harlow and would try again after her, but none of them generated what she generated. The sense that the electricity was real and uncontrolled and might at any moment do something the studio had not scripted. She was also, in the spring of 1937, 26 years old, and in the middle of production on a film called Saratoga when she began to feel seriously unwell. Her complexion had turned yellowish. She was retaining fluid. She was exhausted in a way that sleep was not addressing. Those working alongside her on set noticed the change and mentioned it among themselves. No one felt empowered to act. Harlow had developed acute nephritis, a serious kidney condition that, in 1937, was survivable with prompt medical intervention. Her mother, a devout Christian Scientist, held religious objections to conventional treatment that were sincere and deeply held and, in this instance, catastrophic in their practical consequences. According to multiple accounts from people present during Harlow's final weeks, those objections delayed the seeking of proper care by days that later seemed like an unbearable luxury of time. Louis B. Mayer, who was aware of the situation and had the authority to intervene, did not override the mother's position. By the time Harlow was hospitalized, the condition had progressed beyond what treatment could reverse. She passed away on June 7, 1937. She was 26 years old. She had been in the middle of a film. MGM moved with the efficiency that defined the studio at its most purposeful and its most troubling. Saratoga was completed using a body double and camera angles that kept the substitute's face turned away from the lens. The finished film was released 2 months after her passing. Audiences went to see it in extraordinary numbers, knowing their star was gone. A film that functioned simultaneously as entertainment and as a farewell no one had intended to produce. The picture grossed more than $2 million in its opening weeks alone, an extraordinary sum for the era. The studio's answer to the unanswerable question of whether her passing had been preventable was to release the finished picture with someone else's hands and someone else's silhouette standing in for the woman the audience had come to see. The machine that had made her continued without her, because that is what machines do. And if you are finding these stories as extraordinary as we do, we would love to have you with us for every one we uncover. Please subscribe to Golden Age Files so you never miss what we find next. The woman who erased her own mother, Merle Oberon, was presented to audiences as having been born in Tasmania, Australia, a location chosen by studio publicists deliberately because its public records had been substantially destroyed in a fire, making the claim nearly impossible to disprove. The truth was that Oberon had been born Estelle Merle O'Brien Thompson in Bombay in 1911, the daughter of a mixed-race mother and a British father, in circumstances that the Hollywood of the 1930s would have considered professionally fatal. The studio understood this. Oberon understood this. And so they built a fiction together and maintained it with the discipline of people who understood that a single lapse could bring everything down. The fiction required extraordinary maintenance. Oberon worked under specialized lighting setups on every production, carefully managing to present her complexion as consistent with the Tasmanian aristocrat the publicity department had invented. She declined interviews that probed her origins. She avoided situations where someone from her past might surface. She became extraordinarily skilled at offering charming non-answers that left journalists with the impression they had learned something when they had learned nothing. She turned down roles that would have required filming in India, claiming other commitments, when the real reason was the impossibility of returning to a place where the fiction could collapse without warning. But the detail that transforms this from a studio cover story into something genuinely harder to absorb is this. When Oberon became a star, her biological mother, Constance, came to Hollywood. She did not come as a visiting relation, acknowledged and introduced. She came as an employee. She worked as her maid. Oberon's mother served her daughter's guests, cleaned her daughter's home, and introduced herself to everyone she met by a different name, Charlotte, as she had been instructed to do. Every day, in the house her daughter owned, she was a stranger. Consider what that daily life required of Constance. To hear her daughter addressed by a name that was not the one she had given her. To watch strangers embrace her daughter with an ease she herself was forbidden. To answer to Charlotte when someone called out for the maid. To accept a wage from the daughter she had sacrificed everything to protect and who could not afford to acknowledge her. There is no record of what Constance felt about any of this, because no one thought to ask her? That silence is itself a significant part of the story. Oberon maintained the fiction until her passing in 1979. Her husband did not know the truth. Her children did not know the truth. The woman who had been her mother and her maid passed without ever being publicly acknowledged by the daughters she had served. Two women had kept the same secret from opposite sides of it for an entire lifetime. One had chosen the secret to survive. The other had no choice at all. The night the studios went to war with themselves. Hollywood's golden age was built on competition so intense it occasionally crossed into something closer to institutional espionage, and nowhere did that espionage produce more spectacular consequences than in the story of a literary representative whose name has been deliberately omitted from most accounts of what happened, for reasons that will become immediately apparent. Story properties were the industry's most valuable raw material, and the traffic in borrowed ideas was constant and largely accepted as the cost of doing business. Every studio knew it happened. Every studio participated in it while publicly condemning it. This particular representative understood that dynamic better than most. He had spent years operating between MGM and Paramount, two studios whose mutual suspicion was so thorough it had shaped how both organizations communicated internally, what they committed to writing, and who they trusted with sensitive information. And at some point in the 1930s, he made a decision that was either extraordinarily bold or extraordinarily foolish, depending entirely on how quickly you can leave the country. He sold the same property to both studios simultaneously, the same underlying material, the same rights. Two separate contracts, two separate payments. Two studios each believing they had acquired something exclusively. MGM assigned writers to it. Paramount assigned writers to it. Both story departments began development in the confident assumption that they alone held the property. Until the situation might have remained undetected indefinitely had both studios' legal departments not arrived independently at the same conclusion on the same day and dispatched formal cease and desist letters to each other simultaneously. The letters crossed in the post. They arrived at their respective destinations within hours of each other. The attorneys who received them, read them again, and sat in silence while they attempted to formulate a response to a situation for which no protocol existed. One account suggests that the two lead attorneys telephoned each other, realized they had sent identical letters simultaneously, and then sat together in a second, longer silence before either spoke. The representative had collected two payments and departed the country with timing that suggested the departure had been planned in advance. He was not located. Both pictures were eventually produced under different titles. Both performed adequately. The studios, for reasons of institutional dignity, told no one. He is perhaps the only person in Hollywood history who successfully defrauded both MGM and Paramount simultaneously and was never made to answer for it. The unsolved affair that finished a career. Mabel Normand was, before Chaplin refined the form, arguably the greatest physical comedian in silent film. And what happened to her career in 1922 is one of the most painful illustrations of how completely the Golden Age system could bring an end to a woman it had decided was no longer worth protecting. Her timing was instinctive, her physical comedy original in ways that other performers studied and borrowed from without attribution, and her screen presence carried a warmth that survived even the limitations of silent film's expressive vocabulary. Director William Desmond Taylor was her close friend and trusted confidant, one of the most respected figures in the early industry, a man whose bungalow in the Westlake district was a gathering place for the people who mattered in 1920s Hollywood. On the evening of February 1st, 1922, Normand was the last person known to have visited Taylor. She arrived in the early evening, they spent time together, and she left at approximately 7:30, walked to her waiting car, and drove away. Taylor was found the following morning, having been shot, and the investigation was immediately and catastrophically compromised. Paramount Studios dispatched executives to the bungalow before the police arrived. Witnesses described documents, personal correspondence, and materials of an apparently compromising nature being removed from the premises. By the time detectives arrived, the scene had been professionally curated by people whose primary interest was emphatically not justice. One detective later noted in his report that the crime scene showed clear signs of having been disturbed prior to the arrival of law enforcement, a detail that has haunted the investigation ever since. Among the items later discovered missing was a collection of private letters whose contents were never established. Normand was never charged. She cooperated with investigators fully and consistently. But the studios had made their calculation, and she could feel it happening. The gradual withdrawal of offers, the calls that stopped coming, the invitations that no longer arrived. Scripts that had been promised found other actresses. Directors who had spoken warmly of working with her became unavailable. The industry did not announce its verdict. It enacted it, one unreturned telephone call at a time. She passed away in 1930 at 37 years old. The woman who had been funny before anyone else had figured out how to be funny on camera. Erased not by anything she had done, but by an industry's calculation that her proximity to an unsolved case was more expensive than her talent was worth. The files remain open to this day. The fan who changed everything. Jean Tierney was one of the most exquisite women ever photographed by a Hollywood camera, a beauty so precise and symmetrical it registered as almost architectural. Her role in Laura, as a murder victim so beautiful that men fall in love with her portrait, seemed to mirror something about Tierney herself, a woman around whom extraordinary and terrible things gathered without obvious explanation. During the war, Tierney attended a USO celebrity event and spent an evening greeting hundreds of servicemen and women. Weeks later, she learned she was expecting a child. Her daughter Daria was born with disabilities so catastrophic, their full extent took time to comprehend. Unable to hear, partially unable to see, severely developmentally impaired, as a result of rubella contracted during the pregnancy. And Tierney immediately and quietly arranged specialized care, telling almost no one what had happened or why. She returned to work and maintained the composed and luminous public face her audience expected, giving no indication of what she was carrying. Then, at a Hollywood gathering some time later, a young woman approached her with the cheerful confidence of a devoted admirer. She explained that she had broken quarantine from a rubella ward specifically to attend that USO event because she had so desperately wanted to meet her favorite actress. She had slipped away from the ward, traveled to the venue, and shaken Tierney's hand, feeling afterward that the risk had been entirely worth it. She appeared to find the memory charming. She had no idea what she was saying. She had no idea what she had done. Tierney said nothing. She excused herself and walked away. She carried the knowledge of that conversation for the rest of her life. In her 1979 autobiography, she wrote about the encounter with a restraint that was more devastating than anger would have been, simply describing what the woman had said, what she herself had done in response, and what she had gone home to that night. The story eventually reached Agatha Christie, who used it as the central premise of her 1962 novel The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side, in which a beloved actress's child is similarly devastated by a fan's careless act. In Christie's version, the mother finds a way to respond. Tierney had no such option. She had only the knowledge and the silence and Daria. The night Ingrid Bergman became public enemy number one. In the 1940s, Ingrid Bergman was the actress American audiences trusted most completely. She had played a nun in The Bells of St. Mary's with a conviction that made audiences believe she had genuinely taken holy orders. She had been the morally irreproachable Ilsa in Casablanca, the woman who chose duty over love because she was the kind of person who could make that choice and live with it. Her image was not manufactured in the usual studio sense. It felt, to the people who watched her, genuinely earned. She was not performing virtue. She appeared to possess it, which made what followed feel like a personal betrayal of a peculiarly intimate kind. In 1949, Bergman traveled to Italy to work with director Roberto Rossellini on Stromboli, drawn by his reputation for work that felt more true than anything Hollywood was offering her. She fell in love with him. She was married to another man. She became pregnant with Rossellini's child while still legally married to her husband. When the news reached America, Colorado Senator Edwin C. Johnson took the floor of the United States Senate and formally denounced her as a powerful influence for evil and Hollywood's apostle of degradation. He called for her to be barred from re-entering the United States. He also called for a licensing system that would require performers to meet moral standards before being permitted to work, a proposal that, had it passed, would have restructured the entire entertainment industry. Churches organized boycotts. Fan mail became something considerably less kind overnight. Theater owners in certain regions refused to screen her pictures. The backlash targeted not her professional choices, but her moral character, with a fury that male stars who behaved identically were never made to face. Bergman did not make an American film for 7 years. Working with Rossellini and other European directors, she created some of the most artistically ambitious work of her career, films that Hollywood's commercial priorities would never have permitted. She was liberated, in a manner neither she nor anyone else had intended, by the very punishment designed to destroy her. She returned to American cinema in 1956 with Anastasia, for which she won her second Academy Award. When she walked to the stage to accept it, the entire industry rose. The ovation lasted nearly 2 full minutes, an eternity in an awards ceremony, and left no ambiguity about where Hollywood stood on the matter. The senator who had denounced her is not remembered for anything else he did there. Bergman is remembered for everything. The actress who became a weapon. From one woman's liberation to another's, though the form it took could not have been more different. Where Bergman found freedom in Europe, the next woman carried the war to Europe herself. Marlene Dietrich arrived in Hollywood from Berlin with cheekbones that seemed architecturally improbable and a voice that made entire audiences forget what they had intended to think about before she began to speak. She cultivated mystery as a professional strategy and deployed glamour as a form of power. She was also a woman who understood that fame was a tool and who had decided, with complete clarity, exactly how she intended to use it. When the war began, Dietrich renounced her German citizenship and attached herself to the Allied cause. She had been approached by the Nazi government and asked to return to Germany, where she would have been celebrated and made enormously wealthy. She refused without hesitation and without apparent regret. She was not content to sell bonds on safe stages. She performed for Allied forces at the Battle of the Bulge, in the freezing darkness of a Belgian winter, surrounded by men who had been fighting in brutal conditions for weeks, a Hollywood star appearing in full glamour out of the chaos like something impossible and exactly what was needed. She contracted pneumonia twice and continued performing between bouts of illness. On one occasion, She performed with a temperature of 104 degrees Fahrenheit, wearing a fur coat over her costume to stop shaking long enough to get through the set. Her connection to the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime predecessor to the Central Intelligence Agency, went beyond entertainment. Documents released gradually over subsequent decades describe her involvement in psychological operations, recorded messages using her voice and her status as a figure known to virtually every German soldier alive, designed to carry an appeal that no military broadcast could have delivered with equivalent force. She was, in the formal assessment of the people who deployed her, genuinely useful in ways that had nothing to do with her film career. After the war, the United States government awarded her the Medal of Freedom. The French government made her a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor. She had been, among other things, a movie star. She had also been, among other things, a weapon. Both of these things were equally true, and she appears to have considered neither one more important than the other. The man whose name was invented. 20 minutes after they met, Tab Hunter was born Arthur Kelm in 1931 in New York City. He was 17 when a talent agent named Henry Wilson spotted him at an ice skating rink in Los Angeles. Wilson changed the young man's name on the spot, reasoning through options with the practicality of someone naming a product rather than a person. He settled on Tab Hunter because, as he later explained, it sounded like something you could sell. It did not sound like a person. It sounded like a brand. Hunter had no acting experience, no ambition to become a film star, and no indication his life was about to be redirected by a chance encounter at an ice rink. He was, in Wilson's estimation, a product waiting to be manufactured. Warner Brothers signed Hunter and constructed a public persona with the thoroughness of an assembly line. Fan magazine covers appeared on a calculated schedule. A popular music career produced a recording of Young Love that reached #1 and stayed there for 6 weeks, knocking Elvis Presley's Too Much from the top position. A detail that tells you precisely how completely the manufactured persona had taken hold. A continuous supply of wholesome biographical detail was distributed to a press that consumed it without skepticism. All of it was constructed around a private life the studio understood and actively managed. When a publication threatened to run a story about Hunter in 1950, Wilson negotiated its suppression by offering a different story about a different client. One performer's reputation was handed over to protect another's. This was not an aberration. It was the system operating as designed. Hunter came forward publicly in 1985 and published a memoir in 2005 that described the machinery of his own manufacture with clarity and equanimity. He observed that the name Tab Hunter had always felt like a costume he put on in the morning, something he wore with reasonable comfort that nonetheless never quite felt like his own skin. What strikes a reader most forcibly is not the deception itself, but the sheer organizational effort required to sustain it. The number of people who knew, the transactions required to keep that knowledge contained, and the efficiency with which an entire human identity had been produced, maintained, and eventually retired like any other studio property whose useful commercial life had reached its natural conclusion. We are now halfway through these 18 stories, and we would love to know which revelation has surprised you most so far. Tell us in the comments below. And while you are there, Amister, let us know which Golden Age Hollywood topic you would like us to explore next. We read every suggestion. The lawsuit that changed everything. In 1943, Olivia de Havilland sat across the desk from a Warner Brothers attorney and declined, with a composure the attorney apparently found disconcerting, to accept what the studio had decided she owed them. What happened next changed the legal foundations of the entire American film industry, permanently, and in ways that every performer who has worked in Hollywood since has benefited from without necessarily knowing her name. Standard 7-year contracts in Hollywood contained a provision allowing studios to extend the agreement whenever a performer declined an assignment or was suspended without pay. Only the provision had been inserted into contracts so routinely that the studios had ceased to think of it as a negotiating point. It was simply the mechanism by which the studio retained permanent leverage. In practice, a 7-year contract could be extended indefinitely by the accumulation of suspensions the studio itself controlled. They had used it for years without a successful challenge. De Havilland declined several assignments she considered beneath her abilities. Warner Brothers suspended her each time and added the suspension periods to her contract. By 1943, the studio's accounting indicated she owed them considerably more time than the 7 years she had originally agreed to. She hired an attorney and filed suit. And the studio's confidence was substantial. The suspension clause was standard across the industry and had never been successfully challenged. They expected to win. They had always won. Their attorneys reportedly did not consider the case worth serious preparation. That confidence would prove to be the most expensive miscalculation in Hollywood's legal history. De Havilland's legal team argued that under California's labor statutes, no personal service contract could be enforced for more than 7 years, regardless of any suspension clauses. The court agreed. The ruling, known as the De Havilland Law, still in force in California more than 80 years later, invalidated the suspension extension clause across the entire industry simultaneously. Every major studio's standard contract became unenforceable in its most controlling provision overnight. She had, by insisting on a legal right no one had previously bothered to assert, permanently altered the relationship between every studio and every performer in Hollywood. She continued working for decades, earned a second Academy Award, and lived to be 104 years old. She never appeared to find any of this particularly remarkable, which may be the most remarkable thing about her. If these stories have moved you or surprised you, the very best thing you can do for this channel is to share this video with someone who loves classic Hollywood as much as you do. It means more to us than we can easily say. The cowboy who kept his horse forever. Roy Rogers loved his horse the way some people love their dearest companions, completely, without embarrassment, and with a practicality about what that love required that surprised everyone who encountered it. He was the king of the cowboys, inseparable in the public imagination from his Palomino Trigger, billed by Republic Pictures as the smartest horse in the movies. Trigger had come to Rogers in the late 1930s, purchased for $2,500, a sum that represented a significant portion of Rogers' earnings at the time, and that he later said he never considered for a moment before agreeing to it. Trigger performed more than 60 tricks on cue, received more fan mail than most human co-stars, and had his own publicity agent at the studio. And when Trigger was given a screen credit on one Republic picture, listed by name in the opening titles, the studio received letters from audiences expressing genuine satisfaction at the recognition. When Trigger passed away in 1965, conventional arrangements were insufficient for what the partnership had been. Rogers had Trigger preserved through taxidermy and mounted in a rearing position, installed permanently in the Roy Rogers and Dale Evans Museum, first in Apple Valley, California, and later in Branson, Missouri. He subsequently made the same arrangement for his dog Bullet and his wife Dale Evans's horse Buttermilk. The museum contained 3 beloved animals standing in permanent tribute, an arrangement visitors alternately found moving and slightly surreal, and frequently both at once. When the museum closed in 2010, its contents went to auction. Trigger sold for $266,500, one of the most valuable preserved animals ever auctioned in American history. The buyer was a cable television network that wanted him for display purposes, which means that the smartest horse in the movies spent his retirement years in a museum and his afterlife in a television studio. Roy Rogers had been entirely correct that Trigger was worth preserving. The specific form that Worth eventually took was simply not something either of them could have foreseen. The barrier breaker, who was turned away from the pool. Dorothy Dandridge received her Academy Award nomination for Best Actress for Carmen Jones in 1954, a moment the industry celebrated as historic, while understanding with perfect clarity that a nomination was not equality and that the distance between acknowledgement and equal treatment was longer than any award ceremony could bridge. She was luminous, gifted, and by any professional measure one of the most compelling performers of her generation. She had trained rigorously, worked the nightclub circuit for years before film opportunities arrived, and brought technical discipline to everything she did. She was also an African-American woman working in an industry and a country that had not resolved the contradiction between honoring her professionally while treating her as something other than an equal human being in the practical arrangements of daily life. While performing as the headline act at a prominent Las Vegas hotel, Dandridge was informed she was not permitted to use the swimming pool. Las Vegas in 1954 was as comprehensively segregated as any city in the American South, a fact the entertainment industry preferred not to examine too closely. The hotel's management, confronted with the fact that their headline performer was excluded from an amenity available to any white guest, arrived at a solution they apparently considered reasonable. They drained the pool, not to allow Dandridge to use it, to prevent anyone else from using it after she had touched the water. The pool was emptied, cleaned, and refilled. The process took the better part of a day. The woman whose name was selling out the showroom every evening watched the water level drop from a chair nearby and said nothing that anyone present recorded. She then went inside, changed into her performance clothes, and took the stage. For a moment, hold that image. The woman the industry had just nominated for its highest honor, sitting beside a pool being drained because she had been in it, and then walking out that same evening to perform for a full house. Dandridge did not make a public scene. She continued performing with the professionalism and dignity that defined her career. She left the world in 1965 at 42 years old, alone and financially devastated, despite her historic achievement and everything she had given to an industry that could not protect her from a drained pool. That sentence contains, in miniature, everything wrong with the world she navigated every single day of her professional life. The beauty who built the modern world wrong in a way that the 20th century took 60 years to fully comprehend. That is the only accurate description of what the industry believed about Hedy Lamarr. She was enigmatic, luminous on screen, and possessed of a mind that the studio that employed her never once thought to ask about, because asking would have required them to consider the possibility that the most decorative woman on their lot was also something else entirely. Lamarr had escaped her first marriage to an Austrian arms dealer by disguising herself as a maid and slipping out of the country. At her husband's dinner parties in Vienna, attended by officials connected to the Nazi government and manufacturers of weapons systems, she had absorbed detailed conversations about military communications and torpedo guidance technology. She listened with an attention her husband and his guests did not notice, because they were not in the habit of crediting her with the capacity to understand what she was hearing. She memorized technical specifications that the men around the table discussed as though she were furniture. In America, working at an inventor's table through the evenings while filming by day, She developed with composer George Antheil a frequency-hopping spread-spectrum communication system, a method of transmitting signals by rapidly switching among radio frequencies, making the signal almost impossible for an enemy to detect or jam. The specific application was torpedo guidance, directing a torpedo remotely without the signal being intercepted. They received a patent in 1942. The United States Navy reviewed it and dismissed it as impractical. The officer who signed the dismissal letter did not include his reasoning. He did not need to. She was an actress. The patent expired. Lamarr received nothing. The technology was later recognized as the foundational principle underlying Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and GPS, the infrastructure of modern connectivity that billions of people interact with every hour of every day. The Electronic Frontier Foundation gave her their Pioneer Award in 1997 when she was 82 years old. When told the recognition was long overdue, she said simply, "It's about time." She passed away in 2000. Every wireless device in the world carries, in its most essential functioning, a trace of what she understood and what no one thought to ask her about. The film One Man tried to destroy Orson Welles was 25 years old when RKO Pictures gave him something no major studio had ever given an established director, let alone a young man whose only previous film experience was a short piece he had made himself. Complete creative authority over script, casting, direction, editing, and final cut, with no studio executive empowered to override him at any stage. RKO was in financial difficulty. In a moment of institutional desperation that history has since validated entirely, they gave total creative control to Orson Welles and waited to see what he made with it. What he made was Citizen Kane, a portrait of a newspaper magnate so unmistakably targeted that William Randolph Hearst identified himself in it before the film reached a single theater. Hearst instructed every newspaper in his empire to refuse advertising for any RKO production. He applied personal pressure on Louis B. Mayer to purchase the film and have it permanently removed from circulation. But the action that crossed into something stranger and more desperate was this. Hearst attempted to purchase the film's negative directly, not to screen it, but to have it destroyed before any audience could see it. Mayer reportedly offered RKO the film's entire production budget in exchange for the negative. The number was not small. RKO declined. The studio's president later said that he had simply refused to be the man who burned the best picture he had ever seen. Citizen Kane was released in 1941 to critical celebration and commercial failure. It was withdrawn from wide distribution within months. Welles never again received the creative freedom RKO had extended to him and spent the remainder of his career financing his own projects through means that ranged from inventive to genuinely desperate. He once pawned his personal camera equipment to fund a single day of shooting on a picture he had been trying to complete for 3 years. The film sat in relative obscurity, then slowly, and with increasing momentum, it did not. But by the time critics had finished their reassessment, Citizen Kane sat at the top of every serious list of the greatest pictures the medium has produced. The 25-year-old who had been given everything and had it taken away made, in the brief window between those two events, the film against which all others are measured. Hearst is remembered today almost entirely in relation to it. The negative he tried to destroy survives in multiple archival copies. It will outlast everything. The star who came home. And then there is Jimmy Stewart. His story is the right one to end on, because it contains everything this channel returns to: the distance between the image and the truth, the cost of living inside a public persona, and the extraordinary resilience of the human beings who built Hollywood's golden age. Stewart enlisted in the Army Air Forces in 1941, the first major Hollywood actor to enter military service after Pearl Harbor. He had been rejected initially for being underweight, gained the required pounds, and tried again. He refused a desk assignment and the ceremonial roles his fame made available. He flew combat missions over Europe as a bomber pilot and squadron commander, responsible not only for his own survival, but for the men alongside him and the decisions that would determine whether they came home. He rose to the rank of colonel. He flew 20 combat missions. He never spoke about any of it publicly, and in meaningful detail, never spoke about it at all. When journalists asked directly, he would pause for a long moment and then redirect the conversation with the gentle firmness of someone who had made a permanent decision and was not going to revisit it. He returned to Hollywood in 1945, visibly changed. Thin in a way his pre-war photographs made jarring, carrying what his family could see and his era had no clinical name for. What we would now identify as severe post-traumatic stress. He was frightened of flying. He woke from recurring disturbances about specific missions. He was not the man who had left for the war, and Hollywood was not entirely sure what to do with the man who had returned. His first screen test back showed a gauntness around his eyes that the studio's lighting department quietly noted and worked to compensate for in every subsequent production. Frank Capra offered him It's a Wonderful Life, a film about a man who reaches the absolute edge of despair and has shown that his presence in the world has mattered to more people than he ever knew. It was, in retrospect, exactly the right material for exactly the right moment for exactly the right performer. Stewart's performance, and specifically the scene in which George Bailey breaks apart in a way that Hollywood leading men of that era did not and were not expected to. With his face in his hands and something releasing in him that has no clean name, drew on something no acting technique could have produced. Audiences frequently reported the feeling that they were witnessing something private and true, not entirely intended for them. They were not wrong. The film did not immediately find its audience, and it was withdrawn from wide distribution within months and considered a commercial disappointment. Then television arrived, and It's a Wonderful Life became the film people returned to annually, watched in difficult years of their own lives, finding in George Bailey's breakdown something they recognized and needed to see acknowledged. Stewart received letters about it for decades, letters from people who wrote that the film had reached them at a moment when they had needed exactly what it offered. He read every one of them. He was moved in the particular way of someone who did not entirely understand what he had given, but was grateful to have given it. In one of his final interviews, he said that of everything he had made across a career spanning 5 decades, it was the picture he was most glad existed. Stewart continued to fly until he retired from the Air Force Reserve as a brigadier general in 1968. He rarely spoke about combat missions. He spoke about what they had cost him almost never. The film said what he could not. It still does, every time it is watched, which is to say, constantly, by people who have seen it before and will see it again, drawn back by something they recognize without quite being able to name. And perhaps that is the most honest thing that can be said about all of it, that the golden age never fully ended. It lives in the films, yes, but it lives just as much in the stories the films could never contain. There are hundreds more where these came from. We intend to find every one of them. If you have stayed with us through all 18 of these, thank you. It genuinely means everything to this channel. Please like this video if these stories moved you, share it with someone who loves this era the way you do, and subscribe to Golden Age Files so you are with us when the next chapter of Hollywood's hidden history arrives. Until then, these were the stars who built the dream. Now you know a little more of what it cost them.